Hey, everybody. We're adding a special new feature to the podcast where you get to participate by asking a question of my guest. So here's what you're going to do click on the link below, and there you'll find the schedule of my upcoming podcast guests, and you can see who's coming up, what the topics are. And if you'd like to ask a question, just fill out the form there, send that to us, and I will read the question and your name on air and ask the question of our guest, and we'll see what they come up with. So check it out. Click on the link in the show notes. My guest today is Michael Bernstein. Here's his book, The Nocebo Effect, When Words Make You Sick. Check it out. He is the experimental psychologist, and I should say he's one of the editors. There's 4 editors here. We should give them proper credit. Michael Bernstein, my guest today. Charlotte Blees, Cosimo Locher, Cosimo Locher, and Walter Brown. All right, but let me give my guest the proper introduction here. He's an experimental psychologist and an assistant professor in the Department of Diagnostic Imaging at Brown University's Warren Alpert Medical School. His work is focused on harnessing the placebo effect to reduce opioid use among pain patients. Wow, boy, that's a timely skill to have. He's director of the Medical Expectations Lab at Brown. Okay, we're going to have to dissect that. Medical Expectations Lab. All right, we'll get into that in a minute. He's the co-author of the new book, The Nocebo Effect, When Words Make You Sick, along with the co-editors I already did. All right, Michael, nice to see you. I always like to ask my guests, what's your story?
Sure.
How did you get into all this stuff?
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. So I started with my interest in placebo and nocebo effects in graduate school. I came about it in a little bit of an unusual way. I started doing research really on substance use, and I was focusing in graduate school in particular on alcohol use. And it was actually my master's thesis, funny enough, I wanted to do a study to look at whether anxiety would increase how much alcohol people drink in a lab-based setting. But there was sort of a catch in that we didn't have any funds or, frankly, enough subjects who were 21 and over to participate in the study. So because of that, we recruited just any undergrads who were 18 plus, and therefore were not able to use real alcohol. So my advisor and I, we spent quite a bit of time brainstorming, and we ended up doing it all with placebo alcohol. And very quickly, the question of how do you make a convincing placebo alcoholic drink was much more interesting to me than the more substantive question that I started off with about anxiety. And so, I sort of did that study, and then that eventually launched me on to this path of looking at placebos and expectancies more generally.
Oh, that's so amazing. I never thought about that. You mean just like non-alcoholic beer? That's not enough? You just pick it up at the liquor store?
Yeah, so non-alcoholic beer doesn't actually work as well, and there were a lot of lab protocols that were developed, before my study, and those had to do with, you see people pour flattened tonic water from real liquor bottles. You actually spray down the room with like a nasty smelling tequila, just like a bottom shelf alcohol. So as soon as you walk in, you get those smell cues, and you do some other things. We did all of that, and it still didn't work, probably because most of the participants were underage, so they knew it was illegal for us to give them alcohol. And what we did, which hadn't been done before, was we had a couple of Confederates in all of the session. Well, excuse me, we had one Confederate in all of the session. And the Confederate, sort of a long story, but they acted like they were getting a little bit drunk. They referred to their roommate who came home from this study last week and were pretty buzzed from it, and some things like that. And with that, we were able to convince not everyone, but certainly the majority, that they were at least getting a low dose of alcohol. Jury's out on if that would actually work for convincing people of a high dose. The higher the dose, the less compelling it's going to be. But it was a really fun project, and that was sort of my first exposure to doing placebo research, and it really fascinated me from the beginning. Yeah, so that's
Interesting.
where I ended
Yeah.
up here.
Yeah. I wonder how much, I'm just riffing here, how much of
Mhm.
alcoholism is a kind of placebo, or at least perceived placebo by the user, in addition to the actual physiological changes in the buzz you get, and then the addiction to that buzz, but also then the perceived I need this every day to kind of wind down from the stress of the day, or feel good in the evening, or whatever it is your thing is. Would that be a kind of placebo?
Yeah, so if the anxiety relief that you're experiencing, that's ultimately what causes the addiction, is due to an expectancy effect rather than the pharmacological properties of the alcohol, then yeah, that would be a placebo. If I think that's what you were referring to.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, that would be a placebo effect. And they've done these studies. I mean, it dates back to like the 70s, where they would give people real versus placebo alcohol and look at different responses to stress and all kinds of things. Aggression was one that was studied quite a bit, and consistently you get definitely get a placebo effect from alcohol, which is it's no surprise because alcohol, like so many of the other things that I'm sure we'll be talking about, it has to do with responses on subjective symptoms, things like anxiety, things like depression. Um, Sexual arousal would be another one. And so all of that does have a large placebo component to it.
Yeah. So maybe we should start with a definition of placebo, and then
Sure.
what a nocebo is in
Yeah,
response.
yeah.
Yeah.
And I think it actually makes the most sense to define them both at once. So both placebo and nocebo have to do with the role of expectations. And so a placebo effect is feeling better, having reduced symptoms due to the expectation of feeling better or having reduced symptoms. And a nocebo effect is the opposite of that. It would be having symptoms or feeling worse due to the expectation of that. So I think of them as like they're pretty much opposite sides of the same coin.
Right. So, yeah, you talk about, for example, COVID-19. You opened the book with that story because I remember when I got the second jab, Moderna. The first jab did nothing. I mean, it felt great. So, but now that I look back, I can't remember if I was expecting the second jab to knock me out or not, knock me on my butt, because it did.
Uh-huh.
And then I told everybody the story. Oh my God, the second jab was horrible. It was worse
And then
than
I bet it
actually
was
when I.
horrible for all of them too after that.
Yeah, that's what I'm wondering
Yeah.
now. Yeah,
Yeah,
that's such an interesting
exactly.
effect. But of course, you can't imagine placebo working on the virus itself, the SARS-CoV-2
Hmm.
virus, and yet it could still have physiological changes. Like I felt like crap, achy, sore, the runny nose and all the other stuff that went with it. How is it possible that just the expectation, if that was indeed the case, could cause physiological changes like that?
Yeah, it's crazy, but our expectations, it's amazing how much they do govern. And some of the, I think, most interesting studies along these lines. Ellen Langer at Harvard has been studying this stuff for a while, and so like as an example, she did one study where she um, basically participants came into the lab and they were given like a very minor, nothing serious, but like a very minor wound, and they had it so that some participants were in a condition with like a rigged clock. And the clock either went at half pace or double pace, and then a control clock that went at the normal pace. So, in other words, everyone thought, I'm just picking numbers randomly here, but it gets the idea across. The study went on for, let's say, 30 minutes. Some participants knew it was 30 minutes, but some thought it was an hour, and others thought it was, say, 15 minutes. And then when they took pictures of the wound at the end of the study period, which again was in reality 30 minutes for everyone, those who thought more time had elapsed, like independent observers, actually said that the wound, from judging by images, objective images, observed that the wound seemed to heal more so in that condition versus the others. So it's crazy how expectancies relates to all of these experiences, but absolutely, and it does govern. Exactly how this works is another question, and I don't think we know the answer to it. But it does seem to govern um, different kinds of physiological markers.
Yeah, because pain is subjective, but
Hmm.
it's real. I mean, there's actual signals
Oh,
from the
it's very
wound.
real. Yeah.
Yeah. Why does it have to be so painful? This is one of these great evolutionary
Yep.
psychology questions. Why can't it just be like a red light that goes off that goes, don't do that again. Okay, I won't do that again. But don't make it miserable. maybe
Yeah.
it's the
Yeah.
maybe
Yeah.
it's the miserable that makes you really not do it again.
Exactly. Yeah. You're really not going to touch that stove, given just how painful it is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, but like what was it, the gate theory of pain, that like whatever is higher up from where the sore spot is blocking the pain from the sore. Let's say you have a wound or something like your wrist is sore, and then I belong to athletic club, right? So guys are always icing their arms, the tennis guys, right?
Yep.
So I've been reading stuff about ice. Does it really work? Well, my own doctor says if it really worked, like if you really froze the tissues inside your muscles, this is what do you call it when you go on to Everest and you get frostbite? Yeah, like frostbite, right? It's actual tissue damage. So it's not actually doing that. My doctor says that it's just blocking the signals from lower down, and so you perceive it in your head. Well, I'm feeling better now. Anyway, but
So,
but
so does
everybody
your
who does
doctor
it,
say it doesn't actually reduce the swelling?
correct, yeah.
Oh, that's interesting.
But
I hadn't heard that
yeah, and
before.
there are papers to back him. I mean, he sent me.
Mhm.
I said, "Oh, come on!" He sent me papers. But I've talked to other people who go, "No, no, no. It really does reduce the temperature and the swelling, the inflammation a little bit." So I'm not actually sure what to think about that.
Yeah, I haven't heard anything about that, but it does always surprise me how much these kinds of things crop up where different kinds of treatments that you sort of take for granted. And then it's like, oh, actually, that might be an expectancy effect there too. So it wouldn't, yeah, I guess it wouldn't completely shock me, but nonetheless, it does seem surprising because you hear all the time, you've got to ice to reduce swelling.
Yeah, yeah. But so I guess it would depend on how deep it actually goes, the actual lowering of the temperature. If it's deep inside, let's say it's your shoulder blade and it's in the arm socket there. That's pretty thick. That's like a couple centimeters down in there. If it
Hmm.
really lowered the temperature that far down there, wouldn't that do tissue damage? This is the argument that they make.
Huh.
Yeah,
I've never thought about that.
yeah, 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 yeah. Then the other reason I wanted to have you on the show because this expectation effect or whatever we deal a lot with because we deal a lot with alternative and so-called complementary medicine.
Yep.
And people say, "Are you saying it never works?" No, sometimes it actually work. And my favorite study to cite on this is it was a German study with acupuncture and migraine headaches. So, and it was a pretty decent size in. And then they had three different groups. They had the people that got the real acupuncture needles in the spots where they're supposed to be. The little
Uh,
orientation with the map, and
yeah.
you follow the chakras and the energy points and all that
The
stuff.
meridians. Yep.
The meridians and all that stuff, and then the second group got a faux needle effect where they just put the needles in randomly, or they just took the way it works is you have this tiny little needle and there's a plastic sheath around all of them, and they put it like the sheath on there with the needle and they tap it, and so you can actually do that if the they're all blindfolded, and so it could feel like you've gotten the needle put in there but you didn't. So they either did that or they just put the needles in randomly. And then the third group got no treatment at all. And so, but the finding was interesting that the faux acupuncture treatment group had the same effect as the actual so-called real acupuncture effect.
Yep.
So it appears to have nothing to do with the meridians and the energy flow and the chi and all that stuff. But what is it? So I've long thought about this. Is it that you're getting touched, you're being treated, that somebody is addressing you have a migraine, we're going to do this, and you're being touched. We're human, we like to be touched, it's important, and so on. And maybe it's just the doing something that makes the difference.
Yeah. So yeah, there's the doing something. I mean, just you're physically getting in a car, you're driving to an appointment at some preset time, especially if the acupuncturist has maybe a soothing setting where they do their work. The other thing it's interesting about acupuncture too is the needle. Um, I mean, you have to wonder if like endorphins are released by the needle, and so there could be some kind of effect there, even
Oh,
independent of
right.
where it's done. Yeah, the acupuncture literature, and I don't know it extremely well, but it does seem to be a little bit mixed. Some studies seem to find an effect above placebo acupuncture, others don't. they've done things like you've mentioned of putting the needles in the sort of quote wrong spots as the control. They also have designed needles that are retractable, so they're put in the right spot, but the needle doesn't actually pierce the skin. So there's different ways of doing these, and I don't. The last time I dug deeply into it, I couldn't find a real consistent answer to is acupuncture effective above a placebo or not, which is very different from saying, does acupuncture reduce symptoms? Because that seems to be the case that it does. It's just a question of what's causing that, the expectancy effect or, something actually going on with the needles and with where the needles go.
Yeah. Same thing with meditation. Does it work? In part, it depends on what you mean by work.
Yes.
Again, it's probably not going to cure. It's a cure of SARS-CoV-2 or AIDS or something like that.
Yep.
But if it's reducing stress or headaches or pain or I don't know, just subjective ratings, it's likely to have a huge effect.
Yeah, well, even the question, it's always funny because you hear this a lot, well, does treatment X work? And, you don't want to sound too academic, but when you really got to probe that, it's like, well, what do you mean by work exactly? Are you better after the treatment than before the treatment? In which case, tons of treatments work. But that's still a very different question from does it work over and above an expectancy effect, which is the standard that we hold medication trials to. And I think probably for good reason, but we aren't always consistent about that standard, I would say.
Mm. Yeah, I remember when my wife and I went down to Deepak Chopra's center in Carlsbad, California for a long weekend. And and he had been conducting studies on the effects of meditation. Again, it was controlled things where you have the professional meditators there doing their thing, and then you have like amateurs that do it, like once a week or whatever, and then you have people that they just show them right there that weekend. Here's how you do it. Here's your mantra that you chant in your head and all that, and then people that just don't do anything. But afterwards, of course, we felt great. We're down at this beachside resort, this 5-star resort, eating great food and green tea and meditation and massage and, working out every day and the yoga. And it's like, how could you not feel better?
Yes. Well, and meditation too is a tough one because how do you do placebo meditation?
Right.
And I know people have wrestled with that question, but it's obviously a very hard one.
But Deepak's belief is that those expectations actually do change your physiology. So, for example, lowering stress hormones, and that inflammation is one of the causes of disease, or at least how your body responds to disease agents. And therefore, subjective things like what we're talking about here have real world effects on real diseases, not just subjective pain evaluations, say, but at least how your body responds to viruses and bacteria, say, or wounds or cancer or something like that.
Interesting. Yeah, I know that the meditation literature, it's people have been going pretty deep into what kind of effects you can have there. It'll be interesting to see what comes of all of that.
Yeah, I think there needs to be a lot more research, but also what kind of meditation, because there's so many different types. And again, how often? Like once a day, 20 minutes, 3 days a week? When you say does it work? Well, we got to have those objective criteria by which we're measuring to say this is the effect here. You have to do it 5 days a week, 20 minutes a day minimum. Sort of like exercise.
Yeah.
The doctors try to come up with standards. Exercise 20 minutes a day, 5 days a week, something like that. Which I don't think is enough, but
And
they're looking for something.
Ideally you get a dose response relationship. The more you do it, the better you feel.
Yeah. Okay, so the nocebo then would just be negative thoughts or expectations. The pain is going to be really bad. Like, I'm going to prick you with this needle now to give you your vaccine or whatever. I really can't. Like when I have to give blood, I cannot look. And it if I compare it to other forms of pain I've had, it's nothing. Getting, a needle jab to draw blood is nothing. But it's still, I can't look. I just grit my teeth. I mean, I've been in some bike crashes. You would not believe how painful it is. I mean, the description we give is that get your car up to 30 miles an hour. you're just wearing Lycra, like your workout shorts and shirt, and then open the door and throw yourself out on the pavement and
Oh
just skid
God.
and roll. And
Yeah.
I mean, this was
Yeah. It
like,
sounds awful.
1,000 times worse than giving
Right.
blood. And yet for me, I have a bike crash now and then, oh, whatever, finish the ride, take a shower, I'll be fine. And yet the needle thing is even worse. That's what you're talking about. That's those expectations, I guess.
Yeah. Well, and also like, I mean, just compare, because it's funny, I'm the same way too. I have a really hard time with needles, but when you actually compare just the raw physical sensation, I mean, stubbing your toe is a lot worse than getting a
We're,
needle.
we're
Uh,
stepping on a Lego block.
yeah, yeah, that's way more painful. But you also don't know that that's coming. Whereas with a needle, like, there's again, like going back to the ritual, I mean, there's a whole ritual surrounding it. You go into the doctor's office, they wipe off that area of your skin, and like exactly when that needle is coming. So you have the expectations of what's going to happen, but then you sort of have the whole ritual surrounding everything just prior to the needle as well.
What do we know about negative expectations like hexes or, the number 4 is cursed in your culture, or 13 or whatever that was, or people are more likely to die on this day than that day because in that culture this is a bad day or something like that. Is there any truth to that, or are those urban legends?
Oh, there's a shocking amount of truth to that. So the number four, what I think you're referring to is that in I believe it's Chinese and Japanese culture, the number four is considered unlucky.
Yes,
And
right.
then they looked at, and this is not a study for me. Others have looked at deaths according to each day of the month and
Right.
find that when they break it down for white Americans, it's pretty much flat from day 1 to day 30 or day 31. But among Japanese and Chinese Americans, you see a really big spike on the fourth day of the month. So it does become seemingly this type of self-fulfilling prophecy. And that's one of the cool things I would say about this research is these cross-cultural manifestations of it, because it does seem to crop up in those ways. And like similarly, and I think this is Chinese culture. There's um, according to things I'm not totally familiar with exactly the exact mechanism, but like there's beliefs that like certain times of the year it's unlucky to be born, and it so happens that for people who hold those beliefs, folks that are born at that time have a shorter life expectancy than those who are not born at that time, or compared to people who aren't from that culture and don't hold those beliefs. So there really does seem to be some truth to it.
Right. Yeah. That's just so weird because a cause of death, I mean, medically speaking, there should be something, blocked arteries and led to a heart
Hmm.
attack, or, the stroke in the brain, or, something killed him.
Yep.
Um,
Yep.
and I don't know, maybe in that culture, the doctor can write down, died of fear of number 4 or whatever. But what's actually going on? I mean, you don't just keel over dead just because you think you are. I don't know.
Yeah. And obviously, you can't really answer that with the epidemiological studies. I don't think we know what's going on exactly. I would venture to guess, like, if you think that four is a really unlucky number, um, I don't know. I mean, if you're maybe at the end of your life and, it's the fourth day of the month, maybe you behave in different ways than you would if it were the third day or the fifth day. Somehow you're more resigned, or who knows what it could be. But
Yeah, like when spouses die, long married
yeah,
spouses die within days of each other. It's like, whoa.
yeah,
I mean, well, maybe it was just something keeping them going, and then the natural deterioration happens after that. It's just hard to say.
exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. Let me read this portion from your book. I marked different pages I wanted to ask about. So here you're talking
sure.
about um, adverse drug reactions, which I think is super important because of the amount of money. Drug-related morbidity and mortality cost the United States over $500 billion in 2016. Whoa. One such cause is labeled adverse drug reactions, ADR, which is a fancy way of saying drug side effects. A study from England found that over a 6-year period, more than 500,000 people were admitted to a hospital with an ADR. This means that for every 1,000 people who went to the hospital, 15 were there because of an adverse drug reaction. Whoa. But they were sick only from the But were they sick only from the chemical ingredient of the drug, or was their illness due in part to the nocebo effect? All right, go ahead and riff on that if you will.
Yeah, sure. So, that gets at probably the easiest to understand cause or the cause of the nocebo effect, which is these side effects from medication. And so going back to that COVID example, I think that's a good one to jump off at. When you compare side effects for people that were in the placebo arm versus the real vaccine arm of those trials, what you see is that around in the first shot, it was 75%, and in the second shot, it was 50% of the side effects that people experienced in the real vaccine arm were also in the placebo vaccine arm. So you have a case where a lot of the times side effects that people attribute to some type of medication could be due to expectancy effects. And some of the things where that really seems to come up with is like statin medication, as one example. In one study that is often talked about when it comes to the nocebo effect, really, really nifty design. They gave patients, and interestingly enough, these were patients who had previously been on a statin but had discontinued the statins due to side effects. Nonetheless, they got them to be willing to go back on statins for the study. And in 1 month, let's see if I can get this right here. 1 month they took statins. In 1 month, they took placebo. And for both of those, they did not know which one they were getting. So it was like double blind for each of these months. And then in 1 month, they took nothing as a no treatment control group. And what they found is that side effects were about double for both the placebo and the statin month or portion of the study compared to the no treatment portion of the study. But there was very little, I mean, it was really negligible, very little difference between placebo arm and the drug arm. And once again, these are people who had actually gotten off statins because they couldn't tolerate the side effects. And yet it ended up being that 94% of the side effects that they experienced were due to the nocebo response. And there, I think it's also important to distinguish what I mean by nocebo response versus nocebo effect. So, nocebo response refers to like symptoms that you experience, and this could be due to those negative expectations, and that would be the nocebo effect. But it can also just be due to the fact that, like, in day-to-day life, people have symptoms from time to time. It's can have to do with just the passage of time, regression to the mean, all sorts of other things like that.
Mm, right. Yeah, I took statins for a while. My cholesterol was always like on the margin, and every doctor will tell you, just take them. Okay. So I did. And I did have some of the side effects, not terrible, but some of the kind of jumpy leg at night, a little cramping on long bike rides occasionally. And then I tore my Achilles playing tennis. And one of the first things somebody asked me is, "Are you taking statins?" One of the older guys. I'm like, yeah. He goes, aha. I went, oh, come on. This has got to be one of those bullshit things, And I really don't know what to think about it. I've read a bunch of stuff, and my doctor, he explained he's not a huge fan of statins. He's not one of the automatic, everybody should take it like water guys. If you've already had a cardio incident, then probably the statins are going to work. But if you've never had any issues, and you exercise and eat well and so on, probably the effects are going to be harder to see statistically in groups. Anyway, so I don't know if you've read about statins beyond the nocebo effect, but I'm not sure what to think on that.
Yeah, I've only really looked at it in the context of nocebo.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not so sure
So you're not going to give me
beyond that.
medical advice?
No, definitely not.
Yeah. No. Okay. So then you also cite the meta-analysis here. Big report synthesized a bunch of smaller studies. In this meta-analysis, authors looked at 33 earlier studies of the frequency of ADRs in primary care. About half of the studies were based in Europe, the other half in the United States and Australia. In total, the rate of ADRs varied widely from less than 1% to 65%. Right there, I'm like, that's a huge variance. Yep. This is precisely why a meta-analysis can be so valuable, since any one study is liable to over or underestimate the true range. On average, across all 33 trials, the The researchers found a prevalence rate of 8.3%. For every 100 patients in primary care, 8 experienced an adverse drug reaction. While this may seem like a small proportion in the United States alone, there are typically more than 400 million primary care visits a year. 8% translates to 32 million ADRs. Whoa, that's a lot. And they have to be treated. I love this quote you have from Sir William Osler, who you call the father of modern medicine. I've never heard of that, and never heard that description, but that's interesting. He says, the person who takes the medicine must recover twice, once from the disease and once from the medicine. Is that really true across the board? I mean, is that what he meant? Yeah, all medicines?
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure he was being tongue in cheek with that, but the point is it's very interesting when you see these tidbits historically from people that, the word nocebo didn't come out until the 60s, but there were people who seemed to sort of understand the concept that long predated it.
Yeah.
And so that's why that quote was in there.
Yeah, interesting. Okay, just some other sections here. According to anecdotal reports, this man who's being treated for depression swallowed an entire bottle of medication in a suicide attempt after his girlfriend dumped him. Realizing he wanted to live, the young man immediately admitted himself to a hospital where, we are told, grievously ill, he lingered near death. He couldn't breathe. His blood pressure was dangerously low. Doctors then realized the man had been a participant in a study for a new antidepressant, but he hadn't been allocated to the placebo. He'd been allocated to the placebo arm. It was not the poisons of a drug that led to his near lethal illness. It was, the journalist claimed, the nocebo effect. Convinced he was dying, he was actually beginning to die. And then you continue, or whoever your author is here of this particular chapter. Undoubtedly, undoubtedly, these episodes make for compelling column inches and sensational stories. As the journalists say, if it bleeds, it leads, nor are such scoops wholly new. Voodoo death has also been attributed to the nocebo effect. The term was coined by physician Walter Cannon in 1942 to refer to cases in which people died within days of local traditional healers placing ritual curses on them.
Yeah, so, and I'm glad you said what you did a second ago, because I think I'll give this disclaimer once, then I won't give it again. But, so I'm an editor of the book. What you just read was a chapter written by an author, not me. I think that one was probably Charlotte Bleese's chapter, if I have that correct. Yeah. The voodoo death and that story of the antidepressants, that is just really fascinating. It's only a case report, but it was someone who was trying to commit suicide, and they were enrolled in a study, an antidepressant study. And so they swallowed, I think it was like 20 pills or 20 to 30 pills, somewhere in that neighborhood. And then they ended up in the ER, and they were really very ill. And then, like you said, later it was found that they were actually in the placebo arm, not the drug arm.
Yeah. Again, you talk about Henry Beecher. I think that, this is from your introduction here, who served as a physician in World War II, published a series of seminal papers on placebo effect. Beecher documented instances where he gave wounded soldiers saline, that is salt water, but told them they were receiving a powerful painkiller. Beecher did not engage in this deception out of cruelty. It was just the opposite. He was an anesthesiologist, and he didn't have enough morphine to go around. But he noticed on the battlefield it sparked 70 years of modern-day science. The placebo effect, soldiers experience substantial pain relief from the saline. Again, how is that possible? I mean, if you're wounded, you're lying there, and your arm is blown off or whatever it is. I mean, it's got to be truly painful. How is it? How is it possible?
Yeah. So I think that goes to this question of, well, what conditions do placebos work for? And what you really see is that it works for conditions that are inherently subjective, and pain is right up there. It's, either pain or maybe depression. Like, those are the ones where we have the strongest evidence for these placebo effects. That is a story that's really interesting. And it's sort of what sparked the whole, much of at least the study of placebos, was Henry Beecher doing exactly what you just read about. And you can understand why. There wasn't much morphine to go around. He wanted to do something, and so figured saline was better than nothing. You can certainly see it.
Yeah, so it transitions to the ethics of this. I guess it's a form of deception, but Is it a noble lie in that sense, or is it,
Yeah.
or could we reasonably argue that there's so much we don't know medically about pain and how the body recovers and why some people recover and others don't? Why not just say this may work and maybe it will, and that's okay.
Yeah, well, I'm not sure if there would be, if I understand you correctly, I'm not sure if there would be deception there. I think the deception would come from misleading someone, like in that story of Beecher, he would mislead people into thinking that they were getting morphine. But what it does is it really forces you to reconcile with the two different values that, in this manner, come into conflict with each other, which is improving patients' well-being as much as you can and being honest with patients. And so this poses the question of, well, what do you do when you can make the thing you can do to make patients the best is by not being honest with them.
Mm.
And here in the U.S., we would, certainly lean on the side of being transparent and sort of saying honesty is more important than helping patients reduce their symptoms. But that hasn't always been the case, and not every culture thinks that way. So you do see these competing values, or I should say, these values that you wouldn't think would be in competition with each other. But placebos can be quite interesting because it does show how they are in conflict at times.
Yeah, I guess the ethical question comes down to what you mean by a lie or deception. Again, my point is that if there's so much we don't know about how the body works and why, you could say statistically, you have 1,000 people and they all get this particular kind of cancer, 40% will survive 5 years out or whatever it is. You can't point to one of the 1,000 and go, that guy is going to die in this
Uh-huh.
particular time. All you can say is statistically, and the unexplained variance there kind of opens the door up to say, look, we don't actually know what the treatment is. This might work, that might work. Try this, and maybe you need to pitch it a little hard. Like let's try this. This may work.
Uh-huh.
It's in other words, I don't want to call it lying, right?
Well, what's the this in that example?
Try this, whatever it is, the saline solution, maybe not the saline solution, but
Uh-huh.
like, for different kinds of cancers, there's the standard treatments, and then,
Hmm.
and then there's a bunch of alternatives. You just turn to the alternative complementary medicine literature, and there's tons of stuff you could try. Probably
Uh-huh.
most of them don't do anything, but maybe they do.
You mean
Maybe
don't do anything above a placebo,
about
I'm
the
guessing.
yes, about placebo,
Yeah.
but maybe that in
Uh-huh.
itself is has value. And
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah, so I can riff on that
Yeah.
for a minute if you want. So let me go back to nocebo for a second. So one of the things that's been talked about as like what patients or providers can do is something called authorized concealment. So this would be like you go into your doctor, they're prescribing you some new drug, and doctor says to the patient, like, look, I can tell you about the side effects of this medication, but just me doing that is going to make it more likely for you to experience those side effects. So um, if you would like, I can tell you about the ones that would be really concerning and require medical attention, but not tell you about the other ones. And you sort of get the patient's consent for that. And so that's been proposed by researchers in this area, and I think it's something that really ought to be tested more than it has been. It's been tested a little bit, but not much. But it makes me wonder if you could do something similar with the placebo effect. So, like, you could maybe have on certain intake forms. I'm just thinking off the cuff here. Like, could you ask patients ahead of time, you know, explain to them a little bit about what the placebo effect is and say, if there were an opportunity where I thought that you could improve due to the placebo effect, would you like me to take advantage of that or not?
Mm.
And that, I think, yeah, that feels like it gets at this issue of honesty because the patient is consenting ahead of time. So it's not exactly deception, or at least they're agreeing to be deceived, which in a way means that they're not being deceived in the first place.
Mm. Right. Yeah, I mean, my sympathies go out to a lot of these doctors who are pressed to do something, anything,
Yes.
and they don't know what to do because it's hard. It's hard. I remember, I was a caretaker for my stepfather for several years. He was in his mid 80s, and
Yeah.
just aches and pains, and everything starts going wrong at that age. And so I would take him to various doctor's appointments, and can you give me something? I just feel like crap, or I'm in pain, or I low energy, whatever it is. And you could see the doctor struggling, like, okay, I want to help this guy, and here, try this, and give him a script. Give me something I can take, and who knows what works, and it wasn't clear what the problem was. That was the other thing. It was, sort of a Parkinson's like or pre-Parkinson's, or maybe these little tiny strokes in that are not obvious, and it could be causing this tremor or this uncomfortableness or whatever. They really, really couldn't tell. And I think a lot of medicine works like that. It's really more art than science. And so there the placebo is, why not? Here's, try this.
Yep. Yeah, it's funny you mentioned that. So some colleagues and I did a study a number of years ago where we interviewed primary care providers about placebo effects and their experiences with it, and it was really surprising how, to me at least, how forthcoming they were. We had Harvard trained physicians sort of talking about how they um, and I don't know actually if it was Harvard trained, but they were associated with the Harvard hospitals. That they use placebos in their practice, and they knew what they were doing, and I don't think they were happy about it. But I just was kind of blown away. And see, I actually have a couple of quotes here in front of me.
Yeah.
Um, let's see. So one of them, for example, is doctor said a lot of times we check vitamin D. If it's low, you're like, I don't know, maybe I'll just prescribe it. It's probably not harmful, probably good for them, but unclear if that's helping whatever symptom. And so, right along the lines of what you're saying, you can have sympathy for these doctors, but yeah, I think a lot of what they do probably is largely placebo. And I think to a certain degree, many of these doctors kind of understand that.
Yeah. Well, that's how we got into the opioid crisis in the first place, is when the measure of subjective pain became one of the commonly asked or tested criteria that doctors use, right? Blood pressure and your weight and all this stuff. And, what's your subjective rating of pain on a scale of 1 to 10? Where are you today? How do I know that that your 7 is my 7, right? It's the problem of other minds. I don't. But I guess it's a way uh, of setting some benchmark where you can say, okay, you're an 8 today. Now let's try this, whatever the this is, and then tell me next week how you feel, or tomorrow, or in an hour from now. Well, I'm a 5. Okay, well that's good, I think, right? I mean that
It's
is
better than an 8.
it's better than an 8. I get the justification. I mean the Sackler family and Purdue Pharmaceutical, they got what they had coming to them because they definitely knew it was addictive long before they did anything about it because the profits were so huge, no question about it. And there, RFKJ makes a good point about the regulatory capture by big pharma. That does happen. That was unfortunate. But there are a lot of people that are suffering with chronic pain, and they have a hard time functioning,
Yeah.
keeping their jobs and their families and so on. And we have an obligation to do something for them, and the painkillers work. But as you point out in the book, but they all have side effects like addiction.
Yeah, that's a big one.
So tell me about your research on the opioid crisis and all that.
Oh, sure. So I'm just kind of wrapping up a study here. We haven't analyzed it yet. So I've been getting into this field of open label placebos. I don't know if that's something that you're familiar with.
No, go tell us.
Um,
Yeah, what is that?
so it refers to placebos that are honestly described as placebos. So it completely takes away the deception element. So, like if you were in a study, it would be, Michael, take these pills. I've actually got some here on my desk, comes in a bottle and it says
Ooh,
placebo right on there.
that's funny.
And so there's no deception at all. And there have been a number of trials now where they give these placebos to people, all different kinds of conditions. Again, the patient knows that they're taking placebos and they still experience relief. there's certain methodological questions, around like, well, what's the control group for that? And I think those are important things to think about. But putting that aside, you at least get people to do better on those honest placebos versus not on the honest placebos. And so the study that I've been working on now, which we're just wrapping up, been ongoing for, gosh, I don't know, 2 to 3 years at this point, is that we took patients from the emergency room here in Rhode Island, and if they were being discharged with opioids, we randomized them to either get these honest placebos or not. The not being the treatment as usual group. That's just they walk out with opioids or whatever else, just as anyone would leaving the ED. And what we want to do is see if the open placebos can reduce how many opioids they ultimately take. And so hopefully I can have an answer for you in a few months on whether,
Oh,
whether that
interesting.
was
Yeah, that
actually
would.
effective.
But if the bottle says this is placebo, I guess the question is what in people's minds do they read that to mean? Because if the placebo effect is real, which it appears to be, you can't say this bottle contains inert objects that do nothing and will have no effect on you, because
Yes.
the placebo effect is the opposite of that. It may be inert, but it could have a big effect on you.
Yep. Yep. Yeah. So what it is in these studies, and including the one that I've been doing, is that you explain to them about the placebo effect. And so you do, it is tricky because you do give them positive expectancies. It's not just like, here's nothing, I want you to take it. It's, here's a placebo. A placebo means that, it's like a sugar pill. There's no real medicine inside of it. However, the placebo effect is very powerful, and it's been, studied a lot by researchers over the years. People watch a video about the placebo effect. And that's one of these, what I was talking about with it being kind of methodologically tricky, um, is like, well, when you get an effect here, what are you exactly getting an effect of? It's sort of some combination of the placebo itself plus the description of what that placebo is. Um, yeah, and so it does put in expectancies. In the case of the study I'm doing, there's also a conditioning element to it. So what we're having people do, we'll see if they are actually going to be adherent to it, is every time they take an opioid pill, they're asked to take a placebo as well. So let's say they walk out of the ER, they get a bottle of whatever, 10 Vicodin or 10 Percocet. If they're taking, say, 7 of them, then that means that for 7 times, they're taking an opioid and a placebo. And just that sort of, classical conditioning, that repeated pairing, we're hoping will enhance the placebo effect. And there is some evidence of this from the placebo literature. And then they're given the option of taking placebos not paired with an opioid. And so that might be a way of sort of extending that pain relief.
Oh, interesting. I don't know if that would work on me. I've taken hydrocodone for I've had 2 hip replacements, so they give me the big bottle of hydrocodone, and I really like it, man. It's great.
Yes, yes.
I mean, I'm I work out in the morning, and then I would take 1 or 2 of these things, and I'd come to work here and write. And man, I was really creative and energized. I could write all afternoon, feeling good, happy all evening. And then they ran out. And I'm like, "Hey, doc," and he goes, "No, no, no." This is
How long ago was that, if you don't mind me
this
asking?
was well, the second one was 2018, so after the
Okay.
crisis. The first
Okay.
one actually was 2013, and I was able to get more hydrocodone.
Oh, I bet.
And
Yeah.
I don't think I actually have the addictive person. I don't think I would get addicted. I think not everybody does. Some people could take them and not get addicted. And I think I'm one of those. But even trying to convince the doctors in 2018 that I'm one of the non-addictive, no, you're not getting any more. And so
That's exactly what everyone would say.
yeah,
Yeah.
that's exactly what the addict would say. Yeah,
Yeah.
and it's true. I would not want to risk it. I suppose because the effects on people's lives are horrible, from death to losing their jobs and families and so on. Pretty bad. But I would like to think that the placebo wouldn't work. I would notice, but maybe not. I can't honestly say now.
Yeah, and it's also, it isn't like an on-off, either works or it doesn't. I mean, you can have these cases of it working, though not to the full effect of something like an opioid medication. So yeah, it really should be thought of as existing on a continuum rather than a dichotomy.
Yeah. I mean, really, medicine's not, it's old as a profession, but, I'm told by medical historians that it really wasn't until pretty far into the 20th century where it was better to not go to the doctor than go.
I believe it.
Yeah, just all the again all the side effects and all the stuff they didn't even
Hmm.
before Semmelweis, no hand washing, things like that, just basic stuff.
Yep.
Anesthesiology doesn't really come online until late 19th century, and really refine where they could really control it until early 20th century. Wow, yeah, it's just staggering.
And from a research standpoint, the idea of double-blind, placebo-controlled study, I mean, there's some very early kinds of reports. We might talk about what some of those looked like, but um, by and large, it didn't really start to happen at all until like the 1930s, and then it wasn't until a couple of decades later where people were doing it more regularly. So, like the methodology that we take for granted as figuring out what kind of treatment works, works again in air quotes, by which I mean works above a placebo effect. Like that methodology is actually amazingly new.
Yeah, I know. It's like this. We're in the middle of the revolution.
Yeah,
Even
and that's to say nothing of like, the FDA's requirement to show two trials that are effective. And then of course it opens up the problem with the file drawer. You have
right,
lots of
right.
trials that are not effective and just, push it off to the side and not really talk about it much. Um, but yeah, it's from that perspective, you can almost ask the question of like, well, why would you expect medicine to work very well before there was even a methodology that we would accept as being useful to study that question?
Right. Yeah, it's like determining causality in science is a lot harder than most people realize, which is why we have all
Yes.
all these tools. You don't know if it's one of the confounders that you're just not even thinking about, and you think you're studying X, but you're actually measuring Y, and you don't even know that that's what you're doing. So you have to have all these other factors in there and control for those things, which is why I like the comparison method for like longevity, for example. I've had a bunch of the longevity people on the show here. How do you know it's this particular thing and not this other thing? That it's, exercise, or it's not smoking, or it's having lots of friends, or, there's like a dozen different factors that seem to make a difference. And a lot of it comes from, well, we just do because you can't control people. You're in the control group, so you can't have any friends for the next year.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
But you can,
No salads for you for 30
yeah,
years. Yeah.
yeah. So, but you can, after the fact, look at what people actually did. But here again, then, well, what they said they did. It's all self-report. I never eat junk food, and then the spouse goes, actually, he has McDonald's once a week. Oh, okay. you know,
Yeah. So, I mean, right. So there's a self-report issue, but then there's also just I would say the more fundamental problem of some things you can't do experiments on.
yeah.
And yeah, it is interesting to me, those kinds of health studies, because it feels like it's such a messy field. Like, we don't, I mean, how long ago was it when like, fat was really terrible for you? And now the
Unbelievable.
whole,
I know. And
yeah,
the whole
yeah,
food pyramid has been flipped upside down in just the last
yeah.
decade.
And I wonder how much of that, I don't know anything about nutrition science, but I just wonder how much of that is due to the fact that we really, I assume, can't do experiments in these things.
Yeah,
So
you
we
can't.
have to
Right.
do,
Well, there's
you
some
know,
with prisoners because,
yes,
they're not going anywhere.
yep,
Right.
yep,
And they're going to eat what we give them to eat. Right. But even there, the critics have pointed out that the prison population that's in your N is not all the same people. Some people get out, new prisoners come in, they have different, backgrounds on what they were eating and so on. And even that's not for sure.
and I would assume that now it's probably very hard to get that kind of research approved.
Yeah. 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 Oh, for sure. Yeah.
So
So,
answering new questions, I
yeah.
don't know how feasible that would
So you
be.
look at the blue zones, these are the places where people live a long time, like like some island in Crete, I think, and a few other places around the world. So then well, what did those people do for their lives to live so long? Again, it's just an on average. They had this many friends. They walk every day. They keep journals. They eat a Mediterranean diet that's fairly balanced. They don't drink a lot. They don't smoke. Pretty much you can just add it up and get maybe 10 things you could do. But even there, at Skeptic, we deal a lot with the singularity people. We're going to live forever.
Uh-huh.
It's like, okay, good. And I hope you're right. I'm for it. But, is it in fact the case? And well, there's this one study that shows the extract of seaweed or whatever, may make a 1% difference. It's like, yeah, but it's diminishing returns, right? Like, here's the 10 things you could do. Don't smoke, drink in moderation, have friends, work out, and, so on and so forth. And that gets you to like 90% of the way there, and everything else, maybe 1% here, 1% there, maybe, but you look at the studies, N of 6, some tiny little thing. And it's like, I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah, it's amazing to see how much those dietary, guidelines and all of that have shifted, and how much it seems like we don't yet know about it.
I think that's the case. Well, I think aging for the most part is multifactorial, and it just happens across the board in all systems at the same time, roughly in your mid to late 80s.
I'm curious now, the singularity folks, is that due to AI, or is that something different?
Yeah, no, it's AI. These are the AI people, yeah.
Okay.
Like Ray Kurzweil, but others. And also sometimes called transhumanists or the extropians. They're against entropy. Anyway, I find it super interesting, compelling, almost like a religious faith, but faith in technology and science, which I like. And maybe they're right. We're the generation that will live forever. And the argument is what's called longevity escape velocity. So this idea that people are living longer every year. Every year you live, on average, the population lives like a week longer than the previous year, or something like that, or maybe it's a month longer. At some point, if you follow the kind of equivalent of Moore's law curve going up, if you can live a year longer for every year that you live, you reach escape velocity, and you get to live forever. This is the argument.
Right, and that would have to apply to every potential age that one could live at as well.
Yes, right. And I don't think it does. In any case, I think it's that diminishing returns. It's just more of us getting up to the upper ceiling, which is about 115, it appears.
Mm-hmm.
And, there's more and more centenarians than there's ever been. But, no one's making it to 150 now, not even close, because of all the other things that go wrong. Anyway, I'm for it. I'm not against it, but when people ask me this, don't you want to live to be 1,000? I just say, get me to 90 without Alzheimer's. Can you do that? It's like, well, no, we can't do that. It's like, okay, just solve that one thing right there. Alzheimer's, dementia.
Then I'll pass on those extra 910 years.
Yeah. Then we'll deal with the next 900 after that. Right.
Yeah.
And, that's the problem. So, I mean, again, your placebo, nocebo stuff, I mean, it can only take it so far. There's just physical limitations to what we can do, I think.
Yeah. You're not going to use expectancies to cure every kind of ailment. It really has to do with those things that are subjective, that are governed by the mind, however exactly you want to think about it. Psychosomatic would be another phrase that's used a lot here.
Yeah. Well, but again, it's quality of life. You point out at the end of your book here that, health and vitality and well-being are critical. I mean, that's, don't worry about the number of years. And I always tell these guys, don't forget to enjoy today. You're actually alive and young and strong and feeling good now. Don't miss out on that. Right. So to whatever extent these things work, even if it's just subjective well-being, but it's all subjective well-being. I know the happiness literature pretty well. It's all subjective well-being. It's just, you just ask people, how happy are you this hour?
What is well-being if not subjective?
Yeah. Well, there are some objective criteria I'd like to have. Like, I'd like to fly private. So other than that, I don't really care about the money. Okay. I wanted to bring up another thing here.
Sure.
In your book, you talk about Franz Mesmer, the 18th century German physician who developed an interesting cure for a range of maladies. Mesmer believed that illness could be alleviated by using magnets to govern the flow of fluid in people's bodies. This might seem preposterous, but bear in mind that Mesmer lacked any of our modern-day tools of science and medicine. He lived in an era when leeches used for bloodletting were considered therapeutic. Nonetheless, King Louis XVI, King of France at the time, was skeptical of Mesmer's claims. He established a commission to investigate, led by Benjamin Franklin. Franklin and the others did what we would now refer to as placebo-controlled studies so as the commission put it, separate the effects of the imagination from those attributed to magnetism. The commissioners led patients to believe they were being magnetized even though they weren't. But all the usual magnetism side effects were still present. On one occasion, the commission noted that after a minute, a patient began shivering, convulsing, with chattering of her teeth, twisting of her arms, and trembling of the whole body. It's no surprise then that they ultimately concluded the results attributed to Mesmer's treatment were due only to the imagination or the expectation effect there. So anyway, I was going to point out, I already pointed this out to you before we started recording, but we actually published that report from Benjamin Franklin and Lavoisier in Skeptic. Here it is in 1996, volume 4, number 3. I have cases of them right over there if you want to order this one. This is with the kind of militia cover issue there, here's the original French cover of the report in our kind of English version of it, testing the claims of mesmerism. I love the study, and I love that you mentioned that because it was really, I think, the first attempt at a controlled, placebo control effect by magnetizing some and not magnetizing others, but telling them they were magnetized and to see what the effects were. That's so good.
It's really interesting to read that report because, they go through just like, it's sort of think of it as like one case study after another is kind of how Benjamin Franklin and the other commissioners wrote about it. But they're thinking right along the lines of how we think now about placebo effects and doing blinding, the double blind methodology, or at least single blind, the patient wouldn't know. And it's just kind of cool to see how they call it imagination. Now we would call it expectation, but probably it's referring to the exact same phenomenon.
Yeah,
and it's something you can sort of lose sight of it when reading it, but it's like mesmerism was a very common treatment. So this was debunking what in that era was like, something that a lot of people got. It wasn't fringe. To the point where the King of France actually wanted it to get studied. That's what led to Benjamin Franklin doing the report.
Yeah, it's amazing. Our translation of it and publishing of the whole thing was 14 pages long, and it's pretty dense. 14 pages in our page. It's pretty dense. It's pretty long, but it's like a really thoughtful long journal article in which there's even little riffs in the margins, margin A, which I guess it's almost like a little abstract or subhead for what's in the section. Like experiment 8, eighth experiment that gives the same result. A woman believing she is magnetized has a crisis. Ninth experiment giving the same result. A woman who believes she is being magnetized through a door has a crisis. They also did trees. They magnetized trees. People would like sit there and hug the tree. Okay, it's magnetized.
Yeah,
hilarious.
It's been a little while since I read it, but I think they also did the opposite of exposing some people to magnets without them being aware of it. I think they would hide it behind certain areas.
Yes, exactly. Right.
Yeah.
Another control, right? Just in case magnetism really does work. Magnets do something, although they're pretty weak. The magnet on your refrigerator, it's stronger than gravity because it holds itself to the fridge. But if you're more than like a couple millimeters away, it's ineffective. Let's see, 11th experiment, same result. Oh, with a cup. They magnetized a metal cup. 12th experiment, this effect goes so far as to cause a loss of speech. A faux magnetized tree, I think it was. 13th
that's amazing, a loss of speech.
Yes. Well, I know, but this gets us to some of these psychosomatic illnesses that people have where they do lose sight or speech or things like that. At maybe a more modern version is like chronic fatigue. I've known some people that have chronic fatigue. They really are just knocked on their ass. They can't hardly even get out of bed and function. And yet the doctors can't find anything. It's like, my God, it's one of these categories that maybe it's chronic fatigue, whatever that is.
Yeah, well, and also it shows the disconnect between, subjective symptoms and pathology. And it also reminds me of research they've done where, essentially it's like if you have some type of orthopedic issue, there isn't that one-to-one correlation between something wrong in the body and some kind of subjective pain that you're experiencing. Like people have pain without it being clear what the underlying cause is. And then, people on the other side of it oftentimes will not have pain despite there being problems with the disc in your back or things of that nature. And that, it takes us right to what really interesting with the placebo effect of the surgeries. I don't know if you want to get into that,
Yeah,
but
sure. Yeah. Talk about that.
yeah. So I guess the most known example, some of the listeners might be familiar with it, was a study done in the early 2000s, where they did arthroscopic surgery on patients' knees.
I remember that. Yeah. That was a
That one.
shocker.
Yeah, it really was. And so they assigned people to get either the real surgery, treatment as usual, or to get a placebo surgery. And placebo surgery, essentially, they would take patients, they would give them anesthesia, they would do an incision, and then sew them back up and have them be on their way. And there was no difference between those two conditions. And there have been not many of these kinds of surgery trials to date. Really, it's a very small number, but it's actually shockingly rare to find one where a real surgery works better than a placebo surgery. And so we might have a situation where for certain types of surgeries, like those could be very strong placebo effects by and large.
And that was with the arthroscopic, not a total knee replacement. I mean,
Correct.
you would know if you got a new
Correct.
knee. It's a
Yes,
pretty
you would
big
think
thing.
so.
Yeah.
Yeah, right, right. You would think. And orthopedics is a natural place to study this because those surgeries are for people with pain as the main condition. There's plenty of other kinds of surgeries where obviously, those you can't do sham surgery for some of them.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah. Well, my hip replacements, I mean, that made a huge difference for my quality of life. I was just in a lot of pain. I mean, I couldn't
mm,
even stand to lecture. I had to kind of lean or sit or find a
mm.
stool or something like that. And then after that, no problem. But there, it was pretty obvious right there in the x-ray. It's just bone on bone. Oh, okay. But if it was something in between, like, it's just a little achy sometimes and there's still tissue in there, maybe you could try this or that. I could see it might work because there's some subjectivity to measuring it.
Right, right. Yeah, I mean, there's probably subjectivity. Pain is all subjective, but
Yeah,
I think
right.
what you're saying is that there might be the case where there's some kinds of pathologies where it really is the case that the real surgery is going to be better than the placebo. Then for pathologies that are lower in severity, it might be more ambiguous.
Yeah. Well,
And that makes sense to me.
I like to think if I have a tumor in my body and they cut it out, that's got to help.
Yes, you don't want to be in the placebo group for that, where they leave the tumor
Although
in.
there was that, I think it was in the 90s when they started doing full body scans. And then they became cheap enough where people just started getting them for fun. Not for fun, but just, general. I just want to see if there's a tumor growing in there, catch it early. But turns out that all of us have little things growing in our bodies. They're not
Yeah.
really cancerous spreading tumors. They're just little nodules of whatever, and so the risk of actually having surgery, which is not risk free and has side effects, and then you got to take drugs afterwards and so on. That's not worth the risk.
Yeah, both false positives and false negatives are things to be mindful of, and it's not always clear how you balance that. That's funny. I didn't realize that was happening a while ago because that's making a comeback now, right? I
Oh,
think
is
they
it?
they
Oh, I hadn't
have
heard
they
that.
have these scans now that are at a low enough cost where you
I
can
see.
do full body scans. I mean, I'm not inherently saying it's a bad idea exactly, but you certainly have to be mindful that, there's a cost, obviously, to missing a pathology, but there's a
Yeah.
cost to thinking that you found something that's actually fine.
Yeah, I mean, if you have a cancer that is symptom free, like pancreatic, apparently most pancreatic cancers, by the time it's detected, it's too late. And except for that one weird one that Steve Jobs had, he had the kind that
Hmm.
could be surgically treated, but he waited too long because he had a lot of weird ideas about alternative medicine.
Oh, I wasn't familiar.
Oh yeah, no, that's what killed him. I mean, he could have had the surgery and saved him. we
Oh
think. I
yeah, I
mean,
knew he died of pancreatic cancer. I didn't realize
yeah, he had the
he could
one
have been
kind where you
saved.
can tie off and cut out the part and keep the part you need, or something like that. I forget the details of that, but yeah, we did a story about that in Skeptic because he was into like a juice diet. He would just have nothing but fruit. And I
Hmm.
guess he wasn't, for a while, he wasn't into bathing because we read
Oh,
somewhere this was not healthy until his fellow workmate said, Steve, you stink. The juice thing isn't working.
they boycotted that idea.
Yeah. Yeah. All right, let's talk about psychotherapy. I mean, talk about expectation effects and placebo
Oh
or
yeah,
nocebo. What do we know there?
yeah. Psychotherapy, it's a tough one. I mean, it's so challenging because, I mean, psychotherapy is all about more or less the conversation that you have with a therapist. And so, you know, the nature of placebo and nocebo effects has to do with like, the words you use impacting patient outcomes, then, psychotherapy just really hits the nail on the head. And it's something, yeah, it's something that, how a therapist can go about talking with the patient. They could easily, even a very good therapist, the best of intentions, you can sort of see how a therapist can say something that would evoke negative expectations from a client that they're seeing, even if it was something that felt benign, like, a lot of times patients, take a few years to recover from depression fully, something like that. Well, that could perhaps, for some people, actually make them worse. Um, I think it sort of goes a little bit. I mean, this is a bit of a stretch, but it goes a little bit along the lines of like what Abigail Schreier has been writing about. Have you had her on
Yes.
the
Yes, I
podcast?
have. Yes, I have.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm glad you brought that up. Yeah, bad therapy.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's, I don't want to draw a connection that isn't really there, but, I mean, she certainly talks to a degree about how you have people that are sort of acting like therapists, but they don't really have any training in therapy. And I would guess that folks like that would probably be the most vulnerable to creating negative expectations for people that they're talking to.
Yeah, Carol Tavers has been on this for us at Skeptic since the 90s. And the recovered memory movement we followed from fairly early on. It's an old Freudian idea that there's an unconscious and you bury things in your unconscious that are painful to
Hmm.
recall. And so this then got applied to childhood sexual molestation. And then that these adult patients, now this is sort of late 80s, early 90s, started encountering therapists who they were going to for various things like depression, anxiety, sleep problems, whatever, weight problems, whatever it is. And the therapist started thinking, well, this might be a consequence of having been molested as a child. And then they would ask them, and the people said, well, no, I wasn't. Well, I know you think you weren't, but you might have repressed the memory of this because it was so traumatic. Here, read this book. Let's talk about it for the next 6 months. And they kind of, through the power of expectation, through questioning and planting suggestions. And, do you ever have any dreams where the following elements are in the dreams? Well, maybe.
Yep.
Well, think about that. And, then we'll talk about it more next week. And week after week after week, and pretty soon they get a full blown recovered memory, so called recovered memory.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and it's like, Elizabeth Loftus has been studying this for her entire career, and it's just, it amazes me some of what she's come across, that you can get people to believe that, these rich stories of like, if I have the study right in one case, like, um, you know, low level crimes like shoplifting, those kinds of things. And you can get them to recall these sort of rich histories because
Right.
allegedly the person talked to their parents and, the parents talked about this event.
Oh, that
And
was the
so,
Lost in the Mall. Yeah, that you were lost in the mall as a child. Yeah, that's right.
okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Uh,
I forget the specifics, but yeah, because it just goes back to the fallibility of memory. It does not work like a tape recorder in the way that we oftentimes think that it does and certainly want it to.
Right. So just planting to suggest same thing with the McMartin preschool case where they were giving these little children, these are, like grammar school, first grade, second grade, or no, preschool, before, yeah, before first grade, these little anatomically correct dolls, and, tell us where the teacher touched you, point to it, this kind of thing. These poor kids are in these interrogation rooms without their parents and just terrible. They're not allowed to do these kind of interrogation things anymore. But, the children would never lie. Well, they're highly influenced by
Yeah.
adults, right? So planting the idea, the expectation that this is what you should recall, and then you recall it. Yeah, that's a big problem. And
Yeah.
these social contagions like this happen.
Yeah, well, the social contagion stuff. I don't know if you would call this an example of social contagion, um, but well, so going back actually to what you said earlier, I mean, it sounds like a bit of a Kafka trap. If you say that you had this experience, then you had it, but if you say you didn't have it, well, that's just a sign that you had it, but it was repressed. So no matter what you do, the conclusion is the same.
Yeah, so Carol always makes the point that, there are professionally trained clinicians who have a PhD in clinical psychology from a major university. They got their 10,000 hours of training or whatever it is you have to have before you're allowed to call yourself a therapist and have a license. And so in other words, there's kind of a regulatory, not union, but, somebody that kind of pays attention to the quality of what's being done versus, as Abigail talks about, these are just anybody that wants to call themselves a therapist. And that's not against the law. You can call yourself an astrologer or a psychic and whatever. And there's, no one can stop you. There's no regulatory body to control that like there is in medicine. And so, yeah, you end up with these really kind of quacks, or at least they're probably well intentioned.
Oh, I think they are.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I think they are too. But yeah, anyway, so yeah, that's a problem. It's always been a problem, and for the most part, that's a nocebo effect. Although I suppose the placebo would be if just talking to somebody helps, then why not talk to a therapist? And maybe that helps, whatever the kind is, but maybe doesn't matter.
Yeah.
Um, it,
Well, and Schreier wrote about how you can actually have the opposite of that, where talking about negative
oh, makes it
things
worse.
can,
Yes, right.
yeah.
Yeah, right. Over
But I
talking
mean, I
about
can
it
see
or
it.
dwelling
It's
on
tough.
it. Yeah.
I can see it going both ways, and this gets at like I don't want to come across as being anti-therapy. I'm definitely not. I sort of wonder if part of the issue is that if you want to really study the effectiveness of psychotherapy, you might just have to look out at insanely long time periods that
Mm,
researchers aren't accustomed to. Like if a patient is really going through some kind of personal history or some difficulties, maybe maybe the beginning is actually um, really bad for the patient and they get worse for a while
mm,
as they're sort of unpacking whatever is happening, and perhaps the benefit is just a little bit too far into the future. And so I've wondered if some maybe null findings in the literature could be related to the fact that the follow-up periods tend to be on the short side.
interesting. Hadn't thought of that. Yeah, that could be. Right. You don't want to dwell on your problems, but on the other hand, maybe having a refereed conversation that's directed towards some goal is helpful. That's why I
Hmm.
was apparently cognitive behavior therapy is the one that really does work because it's very sort of focused on what's the problem exactly, and let's address that specifically. Forget what happened 25 years ago with your mother. Let's just what's the problem right now. Right. I like
Hmm.
that idea.
Hmm. Well, in CBT, going back to expectations, one thing that CBT in theory should do is it sort of forces people to confront incorrect expectations.
Mm,
So, if like a patient, I don't know, just make this up, a patient has some type of social phobia and they say, oh no, I can't go out into a crowd. I'm going to have a panic attack, hopefully a good therapist can say, all right, well, let's talk about the times you've gone out into crowds in the past year. And so how many panic attacks have you had? And Oh, so you've had four of them, but you've probably been out into a crowd 100 plus times.
Mm.
That type of exchange.
Yeah, yeah. And again, with a time limit on it. Like we're going to spend the next 6 weeks addressing the systematic desensitization, all that kind of stuff. I like,
Hmm.
as opposed to kind of the open end, and we're going to talk forever and at $250
Yeah.
a, some marital and family counseling can be good in terms of a refereed conversation. Sometimes it's hard to talk to people when in your own family when emotions are running high and nobody's being rational and no one's actually listening to the other person. But if you're
Uh-huh.
sitting there and there's a third person who has no commitment to either one of you, I mean, I'm speaking from personal experience here. You can't just bullshit the therapist like you can yourself, right?
Hmm.
So, because they're going to ask you, all right, what exactly did you do, and what did she do, and what did he said and she said, and so on, and you kind of clarify it. Each person, says what they say, and then you have to steel man the other person's position. All right, tell me what you think she is saying about you, and then you repeat it, and that kind of thing
Yeah.
I find helpful.
It might be a case where, good therapy helps and bad therapy hurts,
Hmm.
just to put it bluntly. The systematic desensitization too, that's interesting. And this gets at more basic questions of how do you study psychotherapy? What does it mean to talk about a placebo effect in the context? Some people have actually said that psychotherapy just is a placebo. Sort of by definition, it becomes um, a nuanced conversation. But there was a study that came out quite a while ago. Irving Kirsch, I believe, was one of the authors on it, where they compared systematic desensitization. So this is for um, people that have some type of phobia, and they
Mm-hmm.
gradually expose you to whatever stimulus is causing the anxiety. But he did a control condition where he actually shocked patients to allegedly punish their anxiety.
Mm.
And the idea was like if systematic desensitization works in the way that people think it works, which involves a relaxation component, then that should not be effective. And yet there was no difference between the two. So it does go back to like what's the active ingredient of these psychotherapies? And that's very hard to say.
Yeah, so interesting. All right, let's wrap it up by talking about.
Sure.
I'm glad you brought up Havana syndrome. Everybody but us, and now, thankfully, you have thought this is like some sort of sonic weapon, and so on. But our author Robert Bartholomew, who's the expert on these mass psychogenic
Yes, he is.
illnesses, has a chapter in here from genital shrinking panics to humming giraffes, the many different faces of the nocebo effect. I love that you had that in there.
Yeah. So Havana syndrome. You want me to try to give a
Yeah,
brief
go ahead. I
overview of
mean,
it?
you
Sure.
mentioned it was on NPR. So, I mean, 60 Minutes did, two full episodes of their show, and they did a
Yeah,
follow
one
up.
recently, right?
Yeah, one recently going,
Hmm.
oh, it really looks like it's a sonic weapon. It's like, no, didn't you read the Skeptic article? Not just Skeptic, elsewhere. I mean,
You got to send it to them. Yeah. So Havana syndrome started in around 2017, and there were some U.S. intelligence officers, and it started just a very small number, only two or three or so, and they had these bizarre neurological symptoms, headaches, migraines. They sort of heard a loud noise. I mean, you can read some of these reports, and I think there's some interviews. I mean, it my
yeah,
heart goes out to them. It sounds
yeah,
really quite
yeah,
horrific. I'm not dismissing it in any way. Anyway, so a couple of reports came out, and then there are sort of more and more reports that spread of people with these same types of symptoms. Again, it was concentrated in the U.S. intelligence community, folks that were stationed abroad. Many of them were in Cuba, which is where it got its name, Havana syndrome. And for a while, there was talk of it being, some type of like weapon from Russia, microwave or something along those lines. And, there's just no evidence for it that I'm aware of. And I've certainly looked into this a bit.
yeah.
Um, and, the couple of studies have come out recently where uh, the intelligence officers that have reported essentially Havana syndrome on certain kinds of neurological markers where they do imaging and whatnot. Like they're actually not different than control groups by and large. And importantly, they don't seem to show a decay over time. And not a neuroscientist, but certain markers that you would expect, to see a decay on if there really was something going on
Yeah.
in the brain.
Yeah.
And so, it's hard with these mass psychogenic illnesses, also called mass hysteria, because you can't exactly prove it because that's just proving a negative. All you can do is say, well, there isn't evidence of anything else, and this seems to fit those types of characteristics. And that's, at least as it stands now, that's what Havana syndrome seems to be looking like. And there's been cases just all throughout history. In the Middle Ages, there were people having laughing fits. Um, Literally, they would sort of like be out on the streets laughing until they collapsed. Um, Salem witch trials, great example of this, where people were having symptoms, and obviously they blamed the witches and burned them at the stake. Um, and so yeah, it's something that really has happened historically. The Paris bed bug
Mm.
story of about a year ago was probably the same case where a lot of Parisians felt like they were having bed bugs. There was a huge spike in how many exterminators were called. And, yeah, there were some bed bugs, but it didn't seem to be much different than a typical hot summer in Europe. Um, and so, yeah, Havana syndrome does seem to fit that mold.
Yeah. I'm 99% Bayesian, certain there's no such weapon, and it's all psychogenic. But of course, I mean, there are real things. There really are bed bugs, and
Yes.
people really do get, a little dizzy from various causes or whatever. So you get a reporting effect. Like, I mean, I have aches and pains, and I have this and that happen here and there. I just don't even tell anybody. But if all of a sudden you said, "Hey, Shermer, in Santa Barbara, there's this thing going around, and it's causing these following symptoms," I might
Yeah.
go, "Oh, ooh, hey, wait a minute, that happened to me yesterday. I think I might be part of this," And
It causes headaches and bad
and
sleep.
then I tell all my friends
yeah.
about it. Then they tell their friends. Yeah, right. So it's not. I mean, the problem is saying, well, it's all in your head. It's not in my head. I really was dizzy, or I really fell down, or I really got sick. I was really nauseous. Yeah, But so it's not just in your head. It's not a good phrase. It's there's something really going on. It's just not what you think it is, and then the expectation makes it even worse.
Yeah, I mean, the symptoms are real. It's a question of what's the cause of the symptoms.
Yeah.
So it's not to in any way dismiss that, going back to Havana syndrome, that I do not for a second think that these folks are faking it in any way. I think they
Right.
really do have those symptoms, but do they have the symptoms because of invisible microwaves or radio waves, or do they have it due to the social contagion effect? That's the crux of it.
Nice. All right, Michael, there it is. The nocebo effect from the Mayo Clinic. Very good. When words make you sick, what's the future for your next line of research or people researching this topic?
I would say probably moving to how you can ameliorate the nocebo effect. Some studies on that topic, but lots left to be done. So I think that's the kind of next area that's worth moving into.
Nice. Okay. Well, everybody out there listening, have good positive thoughts, just in case that matters.